Hey everyone, welcome back. We're doing a deep dive today into the controversy around Denali, North America's highest peak.
Yeah.
It's been in the news a lot lately,
hmm
and we're going to dig into why.
Absolutely. It's fascinating how a mountain's name can become such a big deal, right? It's not just about the name itself, it's about history and politics and cultural identity all wrapped up in one.
Yeah, and it's especially relevant because President Trump just signed an executive order, like just
Yeah.
a couple of days ago,
Yeah.
renaming Denali back to Mount McKinley
Right.
and, reversing Obama's 2015 decision.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got a lot to cover. We've got breaking news articles, historical documents, and even some reactions from people on both sides.
Yeah. There's a ton of material, and it gets pretty complex.
Yeah.
But I think a good place to start is by looking at why these names keep changing, right?
Yeah, okay.
Like, on the surface, it might seem like it's just about honoring President William McKinley, but there's more to it than that.
Okay, so what else is going on here? Besides just like a tribute to a past president. Well, you got to remember that McKinley was all about tariffs.
Oh, right.
And that's something that Trump has been pushing for his whole presidency, too.
Yeah, he definitely has.
He's even said that McKinley is like an inspiration for his economic policies.
Mm.
So renaming the mountain after McKinley, it's kind of like a way for Trump to connect his own agenda with a historical figure who had similar ideas.
Oh, I see what you're saying. It's like a symbolic gesture to align himself with a president who also believed in protectionist policies.
Exactly. It's subtle, but it's there.
That's really interesting. Okay, but before we go too far down that road, let's back up a bit and talk about the mountain itself.
Sure.
For the Koyukon Athabascan people, this mountain has always been Denali, meaning the Great One. It's been a central part of their culture for centuries, like way before any prospectors or presidents showed up.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
For the Athabascan people, Denali is more than just a name. It represents their deep connection to the land, their history, their identity.
Right. And it always kind of bothered me that McKinley, the president, never even visited the mountain, so it's not like he had any personal connection to it.
You're right about that. The name Mount McKinley was actually given by a prospector.
Oh, really?
Yeah, William Dickey, back in 1896. And it seems like it was more about supporting McKinley's presidential campaign than anything else.
Wow. So the mountain's name has been like on a roller coaster ride, hasn't it? First it was Denali, then this prospector throws in Mount McKinley, and it's been back and forth ever since.
Yeah, it's definitely been a back and forth. And I think it really highlights the tension between different ways of looking at history and how those perspectives are reflected in the names we give to places.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so let's get the timeline straight.
Okay.
You said that the name Mount McKinley came up in 1896, but it wasn't until 1917 that it became officially Mount McKinley National Park, right?
Exactly. That's when the name really stuck, even though it went against the Athabascan tradition of not naming places after people.
Right, so it was basically imposed on them even though they'd been there for generations. But they didn't just accept it, did they?
No, not at all. In 1975, Alaska started officially petitioning to change the name back to Denali,
Oh, wow.
recognizing, the Athabascan heritage and connection to the land. It took a while, but finally in 1980, they were able to rename the park to Denali National Park and Preserve.
So the park got its name back, but the mountain was still officially Mount McKinley. That's strange.
It is a bit odd, isn't it? But that's how these things sometimes go. It's a push and pull between local efforts to reclaim traditional names and the federal government sticking to what they've already established.
Yeah.
And then, in 2015, President Obama's administration officially changed the mountain's name back to Denali.
Finally.
Yeah, they said it was important to respect indigenous cultures and their historical connection to the land. It was a big win for those who had been pushing for this change for years.
It felt like things were finally moving in the right direction.
Right.
But now, with Trump's order, we're back to square one.
It does feel like we're going backward, doesn't it? And it makes you question the motivations behind these decisions. Are they really about respecting indigenous cultures, or are there other agendas at play?
Yeah, good point. And what's even more interesting is that some Republicans are against Trump's decision, too. Even Alaska's own senators, who are Republicans, have spoken out against it.
Yeah, it's not often you see that kind of pushback within a party, but it shows that this issue goes beyond partisan politics. There's a growing recognition, even among those who might agree with Trump on other issues, that respecting indigenous cultures is important.
Yeah, it's like a basic level of respect that we should all be able to agree on.
Exactly. And Alaska's senators were pretty clear about that. They put out statements emphasizing that Denali is the rightful name, the name given by the Koyukon Athabascan people who have been stewards of this land for generations. They're really making a strong statement about the importance of recognizing and honoring indigenous cultures.
Yeah, that's powerful. It feels like this whole debate goes way beyond just what we call a mountain.
It really does. It's about cultural identity, historical representation, and who gets to decide how we remember the past.
It's about power, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's about understanding the power dynamics at play and recognizing that names carry a weight that goes beyond just being labels on a map. They can be used to honor, to erase, or to claim ownership.
Wow, this is getting pretty deep. Okay, so we've talked about Denali, Mount McKinley, the history, the back and forth.
Yeah.
Now, there's another part of this executive order that I got to ask about.
You mean the Gulf of Mexico?
Yeah. The Gulf of America now, apparently. I mean, come on. What's the deal with that?
Well, it's definitely a bold move,
Mm-hmm.
and it's sparked a lot of discussion. On the surface, it seems like a simple name change, but it carries a lot of symbolic weight, especially considering the current political climate.
Yeah, it's definitely not just about changing a name on a map. It feels very possessive, wouldn't you say?
Some people definitely see it that way. It's hard not to connect it to Trump's America First rhetoric and his approach to foreign policy. Renaming the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America could be interpreted as a way of asserting American dominance, like putting America's stamp on something that borders multiple countries.
That's a really good point, and I wonder how Mexico feels about it. It seems like it could cause some diplomatic tension.
It definitely has the potential to ruffle some feathers, especially given the already complex relationship between the U.S. and Mexico. It also raises questions about what message this sends to other countries, Does it signal a more isolationist approach, a step back from global cooperation?
Man, this is a lot to think about. Every time we dig a little deeper, it gets even more complicated.
It just goes to show you that things that seem simple, like renaming a mountain or a gulf, can have big implications. It's about understanding the context, the history, and the motivations behind these actions to really grasp their significance. Yeah, for sure. Okay, so we've got Denali, Mount McKinley, and now the Gulf of America. It seems like Trump is using these name changes to make a big statement about his vision for America.
That's a sharp observation. It's definitely possible to see these actions as part of a larger narrative, a symbolic reshaping of the American landscape to fit a specific political agenda.
It's like he's trying to rewrite history, or at least how we see it, and the names we use for places play a big part in that.
You're absolutely right. Names have power. They shape how we understand the world. They reflect our values, and they can be used to either reinforce or challenge existing power structures.
This is really making me think about how we interact with the world and how even small decisions like what to call a mountain or a gulf can have a huge impact on how we understand history, culture, and even our own identities.
It's a good reminder that we're not just passively observing the world. We're actively shaping it through our actions, our words, and even the names we choose to use. This is a lot to take in, and I bet our listener is feeling the same way. Before we move on to the next part of our deep dive, let's pause and think about what we've covered. What are the key takeaways that you see from this initial exploration of Denali, Mount McKinley, and the Gulf of America?
Well, I think one of the biggest takeaways is that these naming controversies are much more than just disagreements about what to call a place. They're deeply connected to issues of history, culture, and politics.
Right. And it seems like what Trump is doing is raising all kinds of questions about his motivations, his vision for America, and how his decisions impact the relationship between the U.S. and other countries.
Absolutely. And let's not forget about the human element in all of this. The Koyukon Athabascan people, who have a deep connection to Denali, have been fighting for their cultural heritage to be recognized for decades.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that these debates aren't just abstract. They have real consequences for real people.
Absolutely. And we need to approach these issues with sensitivity and a willingness to understand everyone's perspective.
Well said. All right, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll delve deeper into the historical and political context of these name changes and explore what they might mean for the future. So stick with us.
This whole thing really makes you think about how we see history. It's all about the names we use and the stories we tell, and even whose voices get heard and whose don't.
Yeah, it's like we're always fighting over which version of history is the right one, and sometimes it feels like we're going backwards instead of forwards.
That's a great point. And it brings us to another interesting point in this whole Denali saga.
Okay.
Remember back in 2015 when Obama officially restored the name Denali?
Yeah.
Well, one of the reasons he gave for that was that he wanted to improve relations with Native American tribes.
Oh, right. It was part of his whole thing about acknowledging the injustices that indigenous communities have faced.
Exactly. It was a symbolic gesture, sure,
Mhm.
but it meant a lot. It showed that the government was starting to recognize the importance of tribal sovereignty and their cultural heritage.
But now it feels like we're sending a totally different message with Trump reversing that decision. It's like we're saying, nope, we're going back to the old way of doing things.
And that message definitely isn't lost on indigenous communities.
Hmm.
Many see it as a step backward, like their concerns are being ignored and their history doesn't matter.
It makes you wonder how this is going to affect the relationship between the government and tribal nations. It seems like it could create a lot of distrust.
That's definitely a valid concern. And it highlights how important it is to understand the history behind all of this.
Hmm.
Indigenous peoples have been marginalized and silenced for centuries. Changing a name back to one that reflects their culture and history is a small step, but it's a step towards acknowledging the wrongs of the past.
It's about recognizing that their history and their connection to the land goes back way before any settlers arrived.
Exactly. And it's about understanding that these names aren't just random words of deep cultural and spiritual significance.
So when we talk about the name Denali, we're not just talking about a mountain. We're talking about a whole way of life, a way of thinking that's been passed down for generations.
Precisely. And that's why this debate is so crucial. It's about respecting the cultural heritage of indigenous peoples and recognizing their place in our country's history.
You know, you said earlier that this situation makes you think about the voices that are amplified or silenced in our telling of history. And it occurs to me that this isn't just about Denali or the Gulf of Mexico. It's something we see over and over again throughout history.
Absolutely. It's about who gets to tell the story, whose perspective matters, and whose experiences are remembered and whose are forgotten.
Think about all the statues and monuments that have been so controversial lately. Many of them were put up to honor people who supported systems of oppression and injustice.
And for a lot of people, those monuments are painful reminders of a past that hasn't been fully dealt with.
So when we talk about renaming Denali or taking down Confederate statues, we're really talking about something much bigger. We're talking about how we deal with our history, who we choose to honor, and what values we want to uphold as a society.
It's a complicated and often uncomfortable conversation, but it's a necessary one. It's about recognizing the complexities of our past, understanding those who've been marginalized, and working towards a more just and equitable future.
And this isn't just happening in the U.S., it's happening all over the world.
Exactly. Countries are grappling with their colonial pasts and trying to figure out how to address the legacies of oppression and exploitation.
It's like a global reckoning with history. And it's forcing us to rethink our assumptions about power, identity, and belonging. It's like we're all on this journey of rediscovering our history, uncovering the hidden stories, and trying to create a more inclusive and accurate narrative of the past.
And that journey is far from over. It's going to require open minds, honest conversations, and a willingness to challenge the stories that have shaped our understanding of the world.
You know, what's been really interesting to me is how something as simple as a name can cause such heated debate and strong emotions.
It really shows the power of language and how deeply it's connected to our sense of identity, belonging, and history.
Right. It's like names have this magic. They can bring up strong feelings, connect us to the past, and shape how we see the world.
Think about it, even in our personal lives. Names are super important. We stress over what to name our kids, our pets, our businesses. We know that names matter.
And when it comes to places, those meanings become even more complex. They're tied to our collective history, our cultural heritage, and our sense of place in the world.
Exactly. And that's why these naming controversies can be so intense. They tap into our deepest beliefs, values, and emotions. They force us to confront uncomfortable truths about our past and grapple with tough questions about who we are as a society.
Okay, so we've talked about the history, the cultural significance, and the emotional weight of these name changes. But let's not forget about the political side of things. These decisions aren't happening in a bubble. They're happening in a very politically charged environment.
You're right. We can't ignore the political motivations. And this isn't the first time a president has used his power to make a statement about his vision for America.
I'm sure there are tons of examples of presidents using their authority to shape the national narrative or to push their own agendas.
Definitely. Think about President Theodore Roosevelt and how he created national parks and monuments. It was a way to protect nature, but it was also a way to assert federal control over huge amounts of land and to shape the American landscape according to his vision.
It's amazing how decisions made over 100 years ago still affect how we interact with the natural world today.
And it shows how seemingly ordinary actions, like renaming a mountain or creating a national park, can have consequences that last for generations.
So we've got history, culture, and politics all mixed up in this discussion, but let's bring it back to the present. What are the actual effects of Trump's executive orders? What does it mean for Denali, the Gulf of Mexico, and the people who live and work there?
Well, one immediate impact is that all government documents, maps, and websites will have to use the new names.
So no more Denali National Park. Back to Mount McKinley National Park.
That's right. And the Geographic Names Information System, which is the official database of geographic names, will have to be updated too.
That's a big change, even if it's just on paper. What about the people in Alaska? Will they start calling it Mount McKinley again?
That's a good question, and it's hard to say for sure. It's likely that many Alaskans, especially those who identify with the Athabascan culture, will keep using the name Denali.
It's like trying to erase a name that's been part of a culture for centuries. It's just not that easy.
Exactly. And it shows the limits of presidential power. A president can sign an order, but he can't force people to change their minds or how they speak.
I wonder how this will play out in the long run. Will the name Mount McKinley stick this time, or will people keep fighting to bring back Denali?
It's tough to predict. It's possible that a future president could overturn Trump's decision just like he overturned Obama's.
So we could be in for another round of name changes in the future. It seems like this mountain's name is always going to be caught in the middle of political battles.
That's definitely a possibility. And it shows how important it is to have thoughtful and respectful conversations about these issues.
You know, as I listen to you talk about all of this, I realize that this isn't just about Denali or the Gulf of Mexico. It's about something much bigger.
I agree. It's about how we understand our history, how we treat each other, and what kind of future we want to create together.
It's about recognizing the complexities of our past, listening to the voices that have been silenced, and working towards a world that is more just and fair for everyone.
And it's about understanding that the names we give to places have power, the power to honor, to erase, to divide, and to unite.
So what does all this mean for our listeners? What can they take away from this deep dive into names, history, and politics?
Well, I think it's a call to action. It's an invitation to think about these issues in a thoughtful and informed way.
Right. It's about doing our own research, listening to different perspectives, and being open to challenging our own beliefs.
And it's about realizing that we all have a role to play in shaping the future, whether it's through the language we use, the stories we tell, or the actions we take.
This has been an incredible conversation. I feel like we've just scratched the surface.
There's always more to learn and explore, and I hope this deep dive has encouraged our listeners to keep learning and exploring.
Absolutely. Okay, we're going to pause for a moment, and when we come back, we'll wrap up by discussing what all of this means for the future and how we can all contribute to a more inclusive and respectful dialogue about names and the stories they tell. Don't go anywhere. All right, we're back, ready to wrap up this deep dive, into these names and history and politics. It's wild how much we've talked about just starting with Denali, Mount McKinley, and that Gulf of America thing.
Yeah, it really shows you how something as basic as what we call a place can tell you so much about, well, about us,
Right.
what we value, what we believe, how we see the world.
It's like those names open up all these bigger questions,
Yeah.
right? About who we are, who has power, how we remember what's happened in the past. And that's what makes this whole thing relevant to, well, anyone listening, I think.
Absolutely. What we're dealing with here with these name changes, it's part of a much bigger change in how we think about history, culture, who gets represented. More and more, people are realizing we got to acknowledge those who've been pushed aside, tell a story that includes everybody, and tells the truth about what happened.
And that's where things get really interesting. It's not just about us hearing all this. It's about what we do with it. How do we join that conversation,
Exactly. And one thing that struck me is, well, just how powerful one person's voice can be.
Yeah.
Think about the Koyukon Athabascan people. They fought for decades to get Denali back. They never gave up. They kept speaking out. And in the end, they made a real difference.
That's amazing. It shows you can fight for what you believe in, even when it seems impossible. But it's not always about those big fights, right? It's about the little things we do every day, too.
Absolutely. It's thinking about the words we use, the stories we tell, how we treat the people and places around us.
So someone's been listening to all this. What can they actually do to get involved, I mean?
Well, start with curiosity, I'd say. Take some time to learn about the history of where you live, where you work, places you visit. Look into why things are named the way they are. Ask yourself whose stories aren't being told.
Like you're a detective, right? Digging into the secrets hidden all around us.
Exactly. Once you start asking those questions, you find amazing stuff. And you might feel like sharing what you've learned, giving a voice to those who haven't had one, helping people understand our history better, the whole picture.
And it doesn't have to be this huge project. Start small. Look up your neighborhood's history or learn about the native people who were here before colonization. Or even just talk to someone, a friend or family, about the power of names, what they mean, the stories behind them.
It's those little things, those choices to be curious, to learn, they add up. They can change how we all think about history, culture, who matters in the story.
I like that. It's about taking charge, not just letting things happen, but being part of making the story, making it better.
And realizing we all have a part to play in creating a fairer world for everybody.
Okay, so to wrap up this deep dive, want to leave folks with one last thought, something we've talked about, but it's important. Those names we give to places, they matter. They shape how we see the world, what we value. They can honor people or erase them, those who came before us.
And even what seems like a small choice can have big effects, ripple outwards, touch more people than we realize.
So let's make good choices. Be curious, be respectful, use our voices to build a world where everyone feels like they belong, like their story's being told.
That's a great way to put it. And that's what this whole deep dive has been about, really. Seeing how connected we all are, our stories, our history, how we're all human together.
And with that, we'll let you keep exploring all this on your own. Thanks for joining us. See you next time.